Now let us talk about some advanced features provided by Excel. Now that we have got a fair idea about visualization using pivot tables and charts, let us now move on to macros. A macro is a sequence of commands that you can record and then run later to automate tasks in Excel. Macros can save you time and effort, and they can also help you to create consistent results. To use macros in Excel, you have to first enable the Developer tab if you do not have it already. As we can see, we do not have a Developer tab yet over here. So to add this, go to File, then Options, and then select Customize Ribbon. Now under the Main tab, select the Developer checkbox. So whatever options are checked over here are the ones that you see here. Now when I click OK here, you can see that the Developer tab is added to the ribbon. Now to understand the macros better, let us do an exercise. You can see that I have added two sheets here, one representing the sale of pizzas across different branches in the month of January, and the other one is for the month of February. Now click on the Developer tab. In the code group, you can see the macros option. When you click on this, you should ideally be able to see all the macros created for this worksheet. You cannot see anything listed now because there is no macro created for this specific workbook. So let us look at how we can create a macro. For that, let me close this first. As I said earlier, macros help you to perform a series of repetitive steps with just a click of a button. So if there is a particular action that needs to be performed again and again, you can code it as a macro and then just run that macro when and where needed. For example, I have my sales for the month of January here. Now from this sales report, I want to find out the instances where the quantity sold is more than 200. Now since this is something that I would like to perform every time I receive a sales report, I will capture it as a macro. For that, click on the Record Macro button. In the macro name box, enter a name for the macro. I will name it as format underscore quantity. Remember that you cannot leave any blank space when giving your macro a name. So I have used an underscore here. You can also add a shortcut key for quick access to your macro. For example, I will give it as Ctrl T. If you want a combination of Shift key as well, you can press Shift and then T. So now the shortcut for this macro will be Ctrl Shift T. In the Store Macro in box, select the workbook where you want to store the macro. I will leave it at this workbook only. Under the description box, you can add a short description of what your macro does if you want. Here I will put color code cells for quantity greater than 200. And finally, I'll click OK. Now you can see here that we got a message saying that it should be saved in a macro-enabled workbook. If you remember, we talked about different extensions of an Excel workbook. Now by default, this workbook is saved with a .xlsx extension. To change it to a macro-enabled workbook, use the .xlsm extension. Now it shows as a macro-enabled workbook. So remember that unless your workbook is saved as a macro-enabled workbook or the one with a .xlsm extension, you cannot work on macros. Now I will click on Save. And you can see that that message is gone and this is a copy of a .xlsx workbook. This time saved as a macro-enabled workbook. Now as you can see here, it shows stop recording. This means that Excel will record the actions that we are going to perform on this data now on. So I will start with selecting the quantity, and I want to highlight the cells where the quantity is greater than 200. After selecting these cells, that is column D, I will click on the Home tab, and here under Conditional Formatting, I will go to the Highlight Cell Rules, and you can see that there are various rules listed over here. The one that I am going to select is greater than, and once I click on that, here I would say that I want to format cells that are greater than 200, and then I can select the formatting of my choice. For the time being, I'll leave it at the default one and then click on OK. Now under the quantity column, you can see that the figures that are greater than 200 have been highlighted. Now once I am done, I will go back to the Developers tab and stop the macro recording. Now this is a task that I want to perform every time I have a sales report. So instead of doing these steps every time, I can make use of the macro that I just created. So suppose I have received the sales report for the month of February, and now I want to do the same exercise on that. So either I can go to the Developer tab, and if I click on macro, I can see the macro I created just now, that is format quantity. So all the macros that you create will get listed over here, and you can select the one that you want. So right now you can either select the macro from here and click on Run, or since we have saved a shortcut for this macro, we can directly use that. So it is Ctrl-Shift-T. And you can see that the macro is run, and all the steps that we performed earlier are repeated here in a single step. And it has highlighted all the instances where the quantity is more than 200. Now if you want to clear the rules that are applied on some cells, select those cells, go to the Home tab, and under Conditional Formatting, go to Clear Rules, and you can either clear the rules from the entire sheet or the selected cells. For the time being, I'll say clear rules from the selected cells, and you can see that the formatting is gone.